Okay, welcome to your Kin 225 class for Wednesday, February the 10th. For today's class, we're going over a review of motor unit activation, and then I'm going to introduce the topic of muscle reflexes, and this includes the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. So a couple of multiple choice questions for you. Once all your motor units are recruited, you can no longer increase force output. Is this true or false? This would be false. So you can also increase your force output by increasing the firing frequency of your motor units. So once all your motor units are recruited, you can still increase your force output and your strength by increasing the firing frequency of those individual motor units. Which of the following is not a component of the motor unit? So we've got the brain, motor neuron, and muscle fibers. The correct answer here would be the brain is not a component of the motor unit. So your motor unit is made up of your motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it is connected to. So a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. So just a refresher, this is a picture of two motor units. You've got one here, it's the motor neuron, connected to all its muscle fibers. It's 3 muscle fibers. And then you've got a second motor unit here that's also connected to its muscle fibers. Motor neuron connected to its muscle fibers. So this is one motor unit and this is another motor unit. Now the challenge to getting maximal strength output is to activate your motor units. So, that can be done by increasing the number of motor units activated or the firing frequency. The question here is, where do motor units receive information from? So it's pretty obvious that, they receive information from the brain. So the motor cortex, when you want to voluntarily contract a muscle, you send a message from the motor cortex down to your spinal cord to recruit your motor neurons and activate your motor units. But motor units also receive messages from sensory receptors. And this can be either inhibitory, so it prevents muscle contraction, or it can be excitatory, so it can increase muscle contraction. So whether an action potential is actually generated in a motor neuron and transmitted to its muscle fibers depends on the sum of excitatory and inhibitory input, these are called postsynaptic potentials. So input from one neuron to another could be excitatory, and this is known as an excitatory postsynaptic potential, or inhibitory, known as an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So you can have these neurons sitting in the spinal cord and they receive input from other neurons that can be either excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory input could come from your brain centers. Inhibitory input could come from receptors in your muscle. So this just demonstrates this concept where you have a motor neuron that's connected to its muscle fiber. So again, this would be one motor unit. And then you've got other neurons that send either inhibitory or excitatory input to that motor neuron. And that sum of excitatory and inhibitory input is going to determine whether or not an action potential actually gets generated in this motor neuron. So a question might be here is that, what is the purpose of having inhibitory input to a motor neuron? Because this would prevent a muscle from contracting and prevent it from generating force, which seems counterproductive. But the main purpose probably is protection from injury. So if a muscle is contracting too intensely. So that's what I have from this diagram. If this person's doing the squat exercise, if they're down in this position and their muscles sense that there's too much force being generated and perhaps there's going to be injury to the muscle, then that muscle will send inhibitory input back to the spinal cord to cause the muscle to relax, and then the person will have to put the barbell down here and won't be able to lift it. And this is just a little cartoon about muscle injury. So question here that I've devised that incorporates this concept of receiving inhibitory and excitatory input from neurons onto one motor neuron, to determine whether or not the motor neuron would actually have an action potential and cause the muscle to contract. So the question here is: a motor neuron receives inhibitory input from two other neurons that are delivering impulses, so action potentials, at a frequency of 4 per second, and the same motor neuron is receiving excitatory input from 3 additional neurons that are delivering impulses at a frequency of 3 per second. Assuming that the strength of the impulses from all the neurons is the same, is the motor neuron more likely or less likely to generate an action potential and cause muscle contraction? So it seems like a complicated question, but it's quite easy if you set it up with a diagram like this. So you have your 3 neurons that are sending excitatory input to the motor neuron, and then you have 2 neurons that are sending inhibitory input to that motor neuron. The excitatory ones are sending input at a frequency of 3 per second, whereas the inhibitory ones are sending input at a frequency of 4 per second. So if you add all that up, you get 2 neurons delivering a frequency of 4 action potentials per second that's inhibitory, and then you get an excitatory input from 3 neurons delivering at 3 per second. So you get 8 inhibitory inputs per second and 9 excitatory inputs per second. So in this case, the motor neuron is likely to be activated.